Croeso, Difda, Bernachtin, Gia Hwitch, Fulcher, Daymat. Welcome to the Celtic Myths and Legends podcast. I am your humble host, Sian Esther Powell, and I'm going to be taking you on a journey through all the myths and legends of the 6 Celtic nations. That's Wales, Cornwall, Brittany, Isle of Man, Scotland and Ireland. Welcome. Okay, listen my friends, I really wish that I didn't have to, at the start of every episode, list out a huge amount of reasons for why it's taken me so long to get this episode out. But there's been so many reasons! I've been on holiday twice, I've been ill with a horrible chest infection, I've still got a bit of a cough, it was the Aurora Borealis last night, I turned 30, things have just been going on, guys. Now, I have tried to start this episode about 5 or 6 times, and I had about 5 or 6 minutes each time, and then they've all been lost. So this episode is cursed. I don't even think I'm lying about that, to be honest with you. I remember ages ago, I did a whole episode on Tristan and Isolde, which is, a spoiler alert, kind of what I'm going to be talking about today, and I lost that whole episode, and that was like years ago now, I think. So the universe does not want me to tell you about the Lost Land of Lyonesse and Tristan and Isolde's love story, but you know what, I like to live life on the edge, so I'm going to tell you anyway. That's a lie. I'm very cautious. So let's get into it. What is Lyonesse, and where could it be found? Lyonesse is an old kingdom that was said to have sat from Land's End, the bottom of mainland Britain, and stretched right into what is the Isles of Scilly today. Lyonesse was said to be a beautiful kingdom with farms and many churches and a huge castle-like cathedral in the centre. And who should be heir to such a kingdom as lovely and wonderful as this but the knight Tristan from Arthurian legends? It was Tristan who stole away the bride of his uncle, Mark the King of Cornwall. It seems the poor knight Tristan was doomed on his many adventures, for when he sought to bring the Irish princess Isolde all the way home to Cornwall to marry his uncle Mark the King, they instead ingested a love potion and began a forbidden love affair. And poor Tristan was never to inherit the beautiful verdant lands of Lyonesse, for one day the inhabitants of the land committed such an act of atrocity that in one single night Lyonesse was swallowed whole by the great and powerful sea. So, some of you sat at home might be thinking that sounds really rather familiar, and that's because 5 years ago, would you believe it's been 5 years? Probably would believe, because there is no consistency with the schedule of this podcast. But 5 years ago, I uploaded an episode on the drowning of the city of Ys, and we kind of talked about lost kingdoms and sunken lands and drowned cities. And if you remember, I kind of touched on subjects such as ancestral memory being connected to floods and grains of truth when you've got lots of small islands and potential islands dotted around the coast, and changing landscapes that have always happened with rising sea levels and natural erosion and all sorts of other events. So I don't want this episode to be a complete retread of one that I've previously done before, even if it was 5 years ago, because those of you binge listening to the podcast, and I know that there's some of you out there, thank you very much, doing God's work for me, thank you. It probably feels like you listened to it, 2 days ago. So we're also going to be doing a little bit of flirting with Arthuriana in this podcast episode. I haven't really talked all that much about King Arthur and Arthurian legends, and they have quite a huge place in terms of the mythic landscape of Cornwall. Cornwall. So who knows where this episode is going to go? I wanted it to be purely on Lyonesse, and then it was going to be on Tristan and Isolde, and now who knows? Maybe we might just do King Arthur and Cornwall. How about that? Let's go with the flow. So there is a reason why I usually stay far, far away from Arthurian legends, and the reason is it's really rather bloody messy. There is a reason why there are whole teams of scholars of Arthurian legends. This is a huge body of work which is essentially 12th, 13th century fan fiction. So don't let anyone ever make you feel ashamed of fan fiction. It's not my favourite thing to read, but then again, I like the Mabinogi, I like Arthurian legends, I like Dante's Inferno, I love Greek tragedy. All of this to help paint a picture of a huge body of work with shared authors pinching and adding to characters. So there can never be one true, correct version of these tales. They were written in Middle English, Old Norse even, Middle High German, Old French. So where do we begin? Let's start with Lyonesse. Lyonesse was not always the land that was doomed to sink beneath the waves. Some scholars have even suggested that French authors and authors in continental Europe were so puzzled by the geography of Britain that they in fact placed Lyonesse by Cornwall, when in fact they meant Lothian in Scotland. So in the medieval Arthurian epics, Lyonesse is not drowned at all, for it's explaining a place that still exists. But just like the ebbs and flows and waves of the Great Sea, the story of Lyonesse has been ever-changing for centuries. The first references to Lyonesse sitting beside Cornwall were found within the prose Tristan, a 13th century long prose romance written in Old French and attributed to multiple authors. And it was the following English translations and later adaptations that cemented Lyonesse as a kingdom beside Cornwall, and any associations with lost sunken lands beside Cornwall wasn't made apparent until the 16th century. So how did this happen? How did Lyonesse go from potentially a kingdom at the top of Britain in Scotland to then being situated at the bottom of Britain to then being closely associated with Cornwall and Arthurian legends to then being associated with a sunken kingdom? Well, as it turns out, there are already existing legends of a sunken kingdom in the area that Lyonesse is now associated with. The Cornish name Lathoso was associated with a fictional and legendary land sunken between Land's End and the Isles of Scilly. The name meaning the Milky Ones, in reference to the constant white water surrounding the Seven Stones Reef, which is the reputed place of this lost land. There have been tales of sunken kingdoms and drowned cities and lost lands in Brittany, Cornwall, Wales for centuries. And there are even theories, speculations, scholarly discussions over whether these stories themselves hold key, extraordinary examples of folk memory. Memories of lands that existed before they were flooded, passed down generation to generation through stories, songs, and language. Legend of Cantra Gwaelod in Wales, the sinking of the city of Ys in Brittany, and the lost land of Lyonesse in Cornwall. And as I have often said, stories evolve and change and adapt constantly. There is never one true version of a story. So if Lyonesse has been connected to a sunken kingdom since the 16th century, then isn't it valid in its own way? Is 400 years not enough time to establish something in the mythos of a land, of a region? Let's say for argument's sake that it is. What does Lyonesse and stories and myths of Cornwall have to do with King Arthur and the body of work surrounding him? Spoiler alert, there's a lot of Arthurian legends associated with regions in Cornwall. And I'm absolutely not going to cover all of them in this episode because one, that would, it'd be too long. It'd be too convoluted. And two, I want to be, talking about Tintagel and all that kind of iconic stuff, the birthplace of King Arthur and Merlin's associations with the region of North Cornwall. I want to be doing that in an episode later on down the road, because there's some really interesting elements to that particular side of Arthurian legends in Cornwall, and that kind of pertains to, kings using Arthur as a status symbol by comparing themselves to him. We can have a discussion about the dilemma of these folk tales and mythology as pertaining to real life Cornish history and archaeology, and whether or not sometimes they muddy the waters. And that just isn't right for this episode. That we don't want to cover too many topics, because we want to be able to sit and to marinate in the juices of whatever discussions pop up. I'm never going to say that. Marinate in the juices. Essentially, it's kind of nice to have like one or two sort of main themes present in an episode. Otherwise, it's just too confusing for my little tiny baby brain. And in this episode, I'm very interested in something that I've talked about many times before in many of my episodes. But this idea of stories changing and evolving and, taking on different elements or subtracting different elements that used to be there. I just think that it's just a really lovely metaphor of Lyonesse being swallowed by the sea. And I've been in the sea today, I must admit. I've been swimming yesterday and today, and the waves have been absolutely incredible, crazy. So there's just kind of something about the movement of waves and the sort of encroaching tide on a beach and the changes of stories. I don't know, I'm being really pretentious here and I'm already tired of myself. But I'm kind of fascinated in a story that's associated with Arthurian mythology and legends, Lyonesse, not having any sort of connotations of being a sunken, doomed kingdom, and then now being quite prominent in pop culture, or at least in sort of like folk and heritage cultures and folklore and what have you, being very much associated with that sunken kingdom myth. So let's look at some nice examples of that. The 19th century Arthurian epic Idylls of the King by Alfred Lord Tennyson has Lyonesse as the final battleground between King Arthur and his nemesis, illegitimate son and nephew, Mordred. Lyonesse is described as a land brought forth from the ocean and then cast back. Then rose the king and moved his host by night, and ever pushed Sir Mordred league by league back to the sunset bound of Lyonesse, a land of old up heaven from the abyss by fire to sink into the abyss again, where fragments of forgotten peoples dwelt, and the long mountains ended in a coast of ever-shifting sand, and far away the phantom circle of a moaning sea. There's just something very romantic about the Sunken Kingdom. You can see Lyonesse has popped up in a lot of fiction. There's the Sylvia Plath poem Lyonesse, When I Set Out for Lyonesse by Thomas Hardy, the Lyonesse trilogy by Jack Vance, and my personal favourite, the wonderful, magnificent Brenda Wotton's song Lyonesse, and composed by Richard Gendall, a professor and Cornish language expert. In fact, I think it was Brenda Wotton's Lyonesse that kind of kick-started my fascination with the place. I'm not going to sing it because I do not have the high register that lovely Brenda Wotton did. I have a much lower register. I'm going to just run through the lyrics a little bit. Lyonesse, Lyonesse, where was your shore? Houses and villages, seen no more. Lyonesse, Lyonesse, under the sea, dreams are with Lyonesse, children to be. Dreams are with Lyonesse, children to be. Royal line, where your domain? Of your white palaces, none remain. Royal line, will you return? Where bones lie and remain under the fern, where bones lie and long remain under the fern. Every year, life springs again, giving you chances, healing pain. Every year, we can reveal in golden palaces round a new child, in golden palaces round a new child. Cornish child, you are to pay, travelling with every man on your way. Cornish child, within a white sail, therein's a lioness, black hand, be still. There is a lioness, black hand, be still. Lioness, where was your shore? Houses and villages, seen no more. And that was not the tune of the song at all, so absolutely go and listen to the song Brenda Wootton, Lyonesse, on YouTube. Thank you very much, because it's gorgeous. It perfectly captures that sense of magic and mystery and melancholy and romance inherent in the stories of Lyonesse. And of course, the existence of previous legends kind of help to create a foundation and a bed for this to sit quite comfortably on, and you've got that archetypal fisherman can sometimes hear the ringing church bells beneath the waves, and there's local stories of people seeing underwater cities. And this myth has even been incorporated into, prominent Cornish families' coat of arms. There's a story of a sole survivor, Trevelyan, who was apparently supposed to be the last kind of governor of the kingdom of Lyonesse. And he falls asleep one day with his white horse beside him. Then suddenly hears a great rushing noise and jumps on his horse and gallops over to higher ground, only to see Lyonesse has been swallowed up whole by the ocean. Now, this is incorporated into the Vivian family coat of arms, who have a white horse kind of coming out of waves, and also they are supposedly the kind of the descendants of Trevelyan, the sole survivor of the sinking of Lyonesse. It's always good to have a little bit of a romantic, mythic backstory to your landed gentry, isn't it? So whether it's Merlin conjuring up a storm and swallowing up the forces of Mordred, or it's the citizens of Lyonesse committing an atrocious act and being punished by God, or a natural disaster, or any other scenario surrounding Lyonesse, it's evident that it's quite prominent in the mythic landscape and mythic consciousness of Cornwall. And there's factors that make this much easier to perpetuate. I mentioned earlier the Seven Stones Reef. This is supposedly the area where Lyonesse once stood. And it's a very dangerous reef. It's about 15 miles west of Land's End and 7 miles east-northeast of Isles of Scilly. And it's a bunch of rocks that have caused some of the nastiest shipwrecks on the United Kingdom coast, including the Torrey Canyon, which was at the time the most expensive shipping disaster, and is still the worst oil spill that's ever happened on the coast of Britain. And this kind of creates two situations in which the mystery and legends of Lyonesse can be kind of propagated into the future. One is that this is a very dangerous area to explore, so you're not really likely to get people just popping over to the Seven Stones Reef and having a look to see if there's a sunken kingdom below. There's an estimated 200 shipwrecks that could potentially have wrecked on these rocks. It's a really, really dangerous area. So you're not going to go and explore it. You're not going to go and validate or invalidate any stories. And also the second one being that, as well as fishermen and sailors have heard church bells ringing beneath the waves, there's also stories of them finding glass and wood and other sorts of things that you would associate with a village or a town or a settlement, but things that you could also find from wrecked ships. So Lyonesse kind of exists as two sort of separate entities in a way. Lyonesse is the kingdom found in Arthurian legends, where Tristan is said to be the heir, and Lyonesse is also this sunken, doomed city and kingdom. And then later on, the two kind of merge together and become one. So the sinking of Lyonesse kind of gets swallowed up, if you will, by Arthurian legends and that sort of thing. I suppose one of the first kind of key sources, and again, I'm not going to go too in-depth about it because, as I said, Arthurian legends are so messy. There's so many different versions from so many different countries. But as I mentioned earlier, the prose Tristan, which was that 13th century or 12th century, it might even be, long prose in Old French. That puts Meliodas as the current ruler and king of Lyonesse, and in fact I think is supposed to be the second king of Lyonesse, and he is said to be a vassal of King Mark, but also the father of Tristan, making Tristan the heir of Lyonesse. But that also calls into question some really interesting kind of geopolitical elements. You know, if the king of this region is a vassal to King Mark of Cornwall, then Lyonesse is almost like another region of Cornwall, or like a lesser kingdom to Cornwall, which is just kind of fun to think about because it's also another little tidbit of evidence to kind of validate Cornwall's standing in history and its legitimacy as its own kingdom once. Another really interesting thing about the prose Tristan is that it's the first to really properly involve these characters within the Arthurian body of literature. So there are many versions of the Tristan story that exist before prose Tristan, that aren't part of the kind of Arthurian scenario. You have Beyrol, sorry, I'm not pronouncing that right, Beyrol of Norman or Breton nationality, which is a mid to late 12th century poet who had his own Tristan story, commonly known as a vulgar or common version of the legend, in counterpoint to Thomas of Britain's kind of courtly version of the story. And of course, Thomas of Britain, he isn't the first one to come up with the story. His story is very reliant on previous versions by Robert Wace, by Marie de France, and possible other versions. Now, I am not an Arthurian scholar whatsoever, so as I say, I'm very shallow surface here when I discuss it. I'm not kind of digging too deep. But it seems that the first kind of association of Lyonesse with Tristan exists in that prose Tristan, that 13th century Old French prose Tristan. But Thomas of Britain is said to be the first courtly version of the story. And by courtly, it really is just kind of tidying up and prettying it up a bit for court sensibilities. So I hope that you don't think that this episode has been a bit of a retread of my previous sinking of the city of Ys. I wanted to do something a little bit different with this one, and hopefully I've given you a little bit of a tasty morsel of the Tristan and Isolde story, which I will cover in a proper its own proper episode one of these days. I think we'll do it justice and do it that way, and do like a proper episode like I do with the Mabinogi, when I just kind of recount the whole thing in my own crazy way, and we have a lot of fun with it. But Lyonesse to me is really a beautiful example of stories changing, evolving, adapting, and being so dependent on so many different factors. You know, the fact that there was already an existing legend in the area, the fact that continental European authors were baffled by the geography of Britain, that there's all these different sources in the whole body of Arthurian literature, giving different names and locations and what have you. So many different things have had to happen for us to reach a point where we have this beautiful myth of Lyonesse that's quite clear and iconic in its imagery and quite well known to a lot of people. So thank you so much once again for listening to this podcast. I hope you enjoyed this one. I have been, again, quite poorly, dealing with health stuff for the last few months, but starting to feel a little bit more human in some ways. So hopefully I can start being a bit more consistent with my uploading schedule. We shall see. It's been a little while since I've uploaded, and I haven't had a ton of new patrons in the last 30 days, and that's the only thing I can see is the last 30 days. So I will say thank you to Onyxa. Hopefully I've pronounced that right. I don't know if I can find anyone else. I've got a few people that have joined as free members, which you can absolutely do on the Patreon, by the way. You can join as a free member. You don't have to pay. So I've got Barry Cooper. Thank you very much. So I have some more people that joined as a free member. Gisela, a couple others. Thank you to Mickey for joining as a Red Dragon. Yeah, there's a bunch of people that have joined. Thank you to Paul L for joining as a free member. So I've missed a lot of things in the last couple months, but thank you ever so much to people that have supported me on Patreon. Even if you join for a few months and then cancel your subscription or whatever you call it. Thank you so much. It means a lot to me that you're kind of along for the ride for however long that you want to be along for the ride for. At the start of the year, we actually did do a really fun storytelling kind of event. There was me and a bunch of patrons, and we had like a video call, and we played a storytelling card game, and that was so much fun, and I really want to do that again. So if you are interested in that kind of stuff and keeping up with me, then you can join the Patreon, or you can follow me on Facebook under Celtic Myths and Legends Podcast, or I'm on Instagram at Celtic_Shan. I've set up a website, celticshan.co.uk. It's going to be dead for the moment. I haven't really done much to it, but I'm hoping to, kick myself up the bum, get my health in order, and really start taking this sort of side of myself a bit more seriously, my storytelling side. I am booked and busy though when it comes to presentations and that sort of thing. So yeah, if you are in any sort of organisation and you're ever looking for a speaker, whether that's in person, if you're local to me, Cornwall, Devon, or whether that's online, and you want someone to kind of chat about myths and legends and Celtic stuff, then I'm your girl. I'm ready to do it. I love doing it. It's so much fun. So yes, thank you so much to everyone that's been listening to this podcast for a while. Thank you so much to everyone who's listening to this for the first time. I hope you enjoyed it, and I look forward to chatting to you all again soon. Thank you ever so much, guys. Bye-bye. I am your host, Sian Esther Powell, and that has been another episode of the Celtic Myths and Legends podcast. If you would like to find it elsewhere on the interwebs, you can also find me on Twitter at Celtic Myths Pod, on Facebook under Celtic Myths and Legends Podcast, on Patreon at Celtic Myths Pod, as well as Instagram at Celtic_Shan, and also CelticShan.co.uk. Thank you, Muraz, Diolch, Tachpalet, Guramahagat, Tragare, Guramayed. Thank you, and speak to you next time. Thank you.